Texas, late summer of 1943. The air rippled with heat above the open plains where barbed wire fences stretched endlessly across the horizon. Dust rose from the earth as a convoy of trucks rattled toward Camp Hearn, one of America's largest prisoner-of-war camps. Inside those trucks sat dozens of German women, POWs, former Red Cross nurses, clerks, and Luftwaffe auxiliaries, their gray uniforms wrinkled and eyes hollow from weeks of transport. Their minds braced for humiliation. They had been told by propaganda that Americans treated their captives with cruelty, that they'd be chained, mocked, maybe even paraded through the towns. But when the truck stopped, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of surreal. A group of Texas cowboys stood waiting at the gate, tall, broad-shouldered men in dusty hats and sun-faded shirts. But they weren't holding rifles. They held horses, sleek, calm animals, tails swishing in the hot wind. One young German nurse blinked in disbelief. "Sind die für uns?" she whispered. "Are those for us?" The cowboy grinned, tipping his hat. "Ma'am," he said, in that slow Texas drawl, "how about a ride?" In that instant the prisoners realized this wasn't the war they had imagined. Context, background, Section 1. By 1943, the war in Europe had turned into a relentless storm. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was beginning to grind under the weight of Allied advances. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had surrendered at Tunis, leading to the capture of tens of thousands of Axis troops, Italians, Germans, and even auxiliary female personnel attached to military hospitals, communications, and logistics. But few people realized that among those captured were German women, nurses, typists, signal operators who had served close to the front. These women weren't combatants, but they were still part of Hitler's war effort. And when Rommel's forces collapsed, they found themselves handed over to the Americans. At first, the idea of female German POWs puzzled U.S. authorities. The Geneva Convention had clear rules about the treatment of prisoners, but almost all camps were designed for men. The War Department now faced a strange question: what to do with captured female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht? The answer came from across the ocean. America's vast interior had space and a strange kind of peace. States like Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana had sprawling rural lands, far from any front line, where the U.S. could safely hold its prisoners. By 1943, the U.S. had established over 500 POW camps across the country, including several in Texas that would soon hold over 50,000 German prisoners. Among these, Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp Huntsville became the most well-known. But while men filled the barracks in thousands, a smaller, lesser-known group of female POWs, mostly clerks and medical assistants from captured field hospitals, were quietly relocated under careful supervision. They were transported by train across the American South, escorted not by soldiers in helmets, but by civilian guards and Red Cross women who ensured compliance with international law. What awaited them in Texas was something few could have imagined. The journey itself felt surreal. They had left behind the ruins of Africa, crossed the Atlantic under guard on massive troop ships, and now rolled through endless fields of golden grass and open sky. The air smelled of dry earth and freedom, yet none dared hope. Many expected harsh labor or confinement in chains. Stories spread by Nazi propaganda painted Americans as brutal conquerors who treated prisoners with contempt. When they finally arrived at Camp Hearn, exhaustion turned to disbelief. There were no prison walls, only long stretches of barbed wire. Beyond the fences, they could see farmhouses, barns, and stables, and even hear the faint hum of a small Texas town just a few miles away. Inside, the camp itself was organized like a small village: wooden barracks, gardens, and a canteen that served food according to Geneva standards. But the greatest surprise came when the local guards, not regular soldiers but Texas National Guardsmen and civilian ranch hands, greeted them with casual respect. The women stood silent as one of the officers read the rules. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. No one will harm you. You are expected to follow the camp regulations. In return, you will have food, shelter, and the right to correspondence." To German ears it sounded almost unreal. Food? Shelter? Rights? Then came the moment that broke their composure entirely, the offer of horseback rides. The camp, built near ranching country, had access to horses. Local cowboys who helped maintain the area occasionally let POWs assist with tending stables. Some of the German nurses, who had grown up in cities like Hamburg or Cologne, had never even been close to a horse. To them, it was something from an American film, and the idea that their captors would trust them near animals, let alone let them ride, felt impossible. One of the women later wrote in her diary, "They smiled and treated us as if we were guests, not prisoners. We laughed for the first time in months. For a moment, the war disappeared, replaced by dust, sunlight, and the sound of horses' hooves. What began as fear slowly transformed into astonishment. The women realized that the American strength wasn't just in their weapons, it was in their humanity, and that humanity would continue to surprise them." Context, background, Section 2. As the weeks passed, the reality of captivity in Texas began to settle in for the German women POWs. What had started as fear slowly gave way to curiosity and even gratitude. The guards were courteous, the food plentiful, and the air filled with something unfamiliar. Freedom within boundaries. For most of these women, Texas was a world unlike anything they had ever imagined. The heat was sharp and dry, the sunset stretched endlessly across the horizon, and the nights echoed with the sounds of crickets and country music from distant ranches. Inside the camp, the rhythm of life was surprisingly structured, yet humane. Each prisoner had duties: cooking, cleaning, maintaining the garden, sewing uniforms, or working in the small camp infirmary. Red Cross representatives visited regularly to ensure fair treatment, and the women were allowed to write letters home, though censorship limited what could be said. They soon discovered that American hospitality extended even to their captives. Local farmers often came to the camp gates requesting volunteer labor to help with harvesting. The women, though technically prisoners, were offered the chance to earn small allowances for their work, a privilege under the Geneva Convention. They helped pick cotton, pack fruit, and tend to livestock under the supervision of both American guards and civilian ranchers. That was how they first met the Texas Cowboys. To the Germans, the sight was almost cinematic. Men in wide-brimmed hats, dusty boots, and leather belts, riding horses with a confidence that seemed larger than life. Many of these cowboys were young, some barely out of their teens, drafted into service as guards or maintenance staff. Their easy laughter and laid-back manner puzzled the women, who had been taught to see Americans as crude and undisciplined. But these men weren't hostile. They were curious. On one particularly warm afternoon, a few of the German women were assigned to help clean the stables on the camp's outskirts. A tall cowboy named Ray Henderson, who spoke with a slow Texas drawl, approached them with a grin. "You ladies ever been on a horse before?" he asked jokingly. The women exchanged nervous glances. One, a nurse from Bremen named Liesel, shook her head timidly. "Only in pictures," she murmured. Ray laughed and motioned toward a calm brown mare. "Well, ma'am, that there's Sally. She's as gentle as a Sunday breeze. You treat her right, she'll take you for a little walk." At first, the women thought it was a cruel joke. But it wasn't. Under supervision, they were genuinely invited to ride. A few took hesitant steps forward. One by one, they climbed onto the horses, guided by the Americans who held the reins and gave simple instructions. The laughter that followed was spontaneous. The first pure laughter many of them had known since before the war began. It was a small act, but one that carried immense symbolic weight. These were enemy prisoners, citizens of a nation that had bombed London, invaded France, and fought ferociously across continents. And yet, here in Texas, they were being treated not as monsters or criminals, but as human beings. American newspapers barely mentioned it. To the public, POW camps were a distant reality, but for the soldiers and civilians who worked near them, they became spaces of unexpected connection, a quiet reminder that even in the midst of global war, humanity could survive. Not all the women accepted it easily. Some remained cold, suspicious, and silent, convinced that it was a psychological trick or propaganda ploy. Nazi indoctrination had been deep, and many found it hard to believe that kindness could exist without hidden motives. But others began to soften. They noticed the small gestures, a guard handing them a cold lemonade on a scorching day, a cowboy tipping his hat with a smile, or the camp nurse offering aspirin without judgment. They began to write home differently. Letters once filled with fear now spoke cautiously of decency, even dignity. One letter, intercepted by Allied censors, contained a simple line that said, "We are treated better than our soldiers treat their wives." That single sentence captured the shock and paradox of the situation. By late 1944, as the Allies advanced through Europe and news of Germany's decline reached even the POW camps, the atmosphere among the women grew somber. They no longer feared death or cruelty. Instead, they began to fear what would be left of their homeland. And yet, in the midst of despair, life in Texas continued, routine, humane, almost gentle. Little did they know that their days of unexpected kindness were about to become moments of deep emotional transformation, moments when enemy and captor would share not only the same soil, but a fleeting glimpse of mutual respect. Angles, Section 1. The story of the German women POWs in Texas was not just about confinement. It was a mosaic of human interactions that blurred the lines between enemy and ally. Within the barbed wire and the open plains beyond it, several emotional and moral dimensions began to emerge. For the American guards and the German women alike, daily life in the POW camp evolved into a quiet study of human nature. These women had once served in factories, hospitals, and military auxiliary units for the Reich. They were taught to believe that surrender meant shame, that the enemy was cruel and without honor. Yet in Texas, the opposite unfolded. The American soldiers guarding them were in many cases small-town men, teachers, farmhands, mechanics, now serving their turn in uniform. They did not view the women as ideological enemies, but as displaced humans caught in the machinery of war. Each morning, the guards opened the gates for work details. There was routine and order, but also a strange calmness. The women began to smile, greet, and even joke lightly with their captors. The human barrier that war had built began to crack. One sergeant recalled, years later, "They were polite, proper, and proud, but you could see the loneliness in their eyes. Sometimes we'd bring them apples or coffee just to make the day less hard." For the German women, the shock was profound. The men who had been painted as brutal enemies treated them with fairness and, at times, warmth. It challenged everything they had been taught, forcing them to question not only propaganda, but their own sense of morality. The cowboys who interacted with the POWs became the unexpected heroes of this story. Their world, open skies, saddles, and rodeos, collided with the disciplined world of wartime Europe. To them, offering a horse ride was no political statement. It was a gesture of decency, a way of saying, "You're safe here." Rancher families around towns like Hearne and Hereford, Texas, often hosted work details for the POWs. They treated them like laborers rather than prisoners. Some shared meals, others offered conversation in broken English and German. Photographs later recovered from family archives showed a remarkable sight. Young German women in simple camp uniforms standing beside horses, smiling awkwardly as Texan ranchers looked on. These images were never meant for propaganda. They were honest snapshots of an unlikely intersection of two worlds, war-worn Europeans and freedom-loving Texans. The women's shock was not just cultural, it was emotional. One POW nurse wrote in her diary, "We expected chains and punishment. Instead, they gave us reins and laughter." That moment, sitting on horseback under the vast Texas sun, wind in their hair, American cowboys laughing nearby, became a quiet form of redemption. For a few minutes, they were not prisoners. They were simply human again. The humane treatment of POWs was not accidental. The U.S. military, particularly under the War Department's Special Projects Division, saw value in moral diplomacy. By treating German and Italian prisoners, even women, with respect, the Allies aimed to demonstrate the contrast between democratic ideals and fascist brutality. These camps became living examples of American moral superiority. Red Cross inspections confirmed fair treatment, and many foreign observers documented how POWs were better fed in the U.S. than civilians were in war-torn Europe. For German women, POWs, this was a jarring revelation. The Reich had taught them that the Allies were barbarians, yet here they received blankets, medical care, and even opportunities for education. In a strange twist, America was winning not just militarily, but psychologically. Each act of kindness toward a prisoner became an unspoken message. This is what freedom looks like. Gender added a fascinating dimension to the story. These were not frontline soldiers, but nurses, radio operators, clerks, women who had supported the Nazi war machine in non-combat roles. For them, being treated gently by male captors felt both relieving and confusing. Some had been taught to view men only through the harsh lens of ideology, commanders, propagandists, or abusers. Yet the American men they met were humorous, protective, and often chivalrous. This created emotional complexity. There were moments of laughter, shared chores, even conversations about family back home. But beneath it all, there was guilt. Could they accept kindness from the enemy while their homeland burned under Allied bombs? The Cowboys' playful acts, letting them feed horses, offering small tokens like chocolate bars or Coca-Cola, became emotional lifelines. It reminded them of a world beyond politics. By late 1944, as news of Germany's decline reached the camps, many of the women began to undergo a quiet internal transformation. They no longer saw the Americans as oppressors. Instead, they began to reflect on their own government's lies and failures. In private conversations, they spoke of rebuilding, of wanting peace, of hoping to one day tell their children about the strange kindness they found behind barbed wire. One camp chaplain wrote, "They arrived proud, afraid, and indoctrinated. They left thoughtful, some even grateful. In their eyes, the war had changed shape. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about humanity." The Texas camps had, unintentionally, become classrooms of democracy and empathy. The women who rode horses instead of walking in chains carried those memories for decades, silent witnesses to a paradox of war where compassion could coexist with captivity. And yet, the most emotional transformation, the moment that would stay etched in their hearts, was still to come. A single event would bring captor and captive even closer, showing the world how Texas warmth could melt the cold walls of wartime hatred. If the first days of captivity in Texas had unsettled the German women with unexpected kindness, what came next transformed their understanding of both war and humanity. This second phase of their experience revealed deeper emotional and cultural layers, where pride, curiosity, and compassion intertwined under the Texan sun. Life in the camps was structured but strangely vibrant. While the war raged in Europe, behind the fences of Texas, an entirely different world was forming, one that blended German discipline with American informality. The women decorated their barracks with makeshift curtains. They planted small flower gardens near the fences. Some sang old folk songs in the evenings. It was a fragile attempt to preserve dignity. Then came the surprises. The Americans began sharing their own culture. Country music, baseball, and rodeos became informal bridges of understanding. One weekend, a local town organized a small fair near the camp. The guards arranged for a few POW women to help serve at food stalls under supervision. What the women witnessed was unlike anything they had seen before. Children running freely, couples dancing, soldiers laughing over hot dogs and Coca-Cola. One of the women later wrote, "It was strange. This was the land of our enemies. Yet everywhere I saw life, color, and freedom. No one looked afraid. I began to wonder if everything we were told about them had been a lie." The cultural contrast hit them harder than propaganda ever could. It wasn't a lecture in democracy, it was a lived experience. Trust was slow to build. In the beginning, every smile from an American soldier felt uncertain. Was it genuine or strategic? But time eroded suspicion. Work teams became the heart of interaction. German women were assigned to agricultural tasks, sorting produce, or working in laundry units. The Americans who oversaw these details often treated them as capable workers, not as enemies. One poignant scene repeated across several camps. A young POW woman struggling to lift a feed sack, only for a cowboy to quietly step forward and help, tipping his hat afterward. Small, wordless gestures built quiet trust. By late 1945, many guards reported that discipline was almost effortless. The women followed orders not out of fear but mutual respect. They began learning English phrases. Some guards picked up bits of German. Notes were exchanged, often innocent, about the weather, about missing home, about peace. At some point, one American officer recalled, "You stopped seeing uniforms, you saw faces." This transformation from guarded hostility to shared humanity became one of the unspoken victories of the war. Isolation was one of the hardest burdens of captivity. Many of the German women were young, in their 20s, far from family, uncertain if their homes even existed anymore. When the Red Cross facilitated letters between POWs and families in Germany, tears were common. Many letters came back stamped, "Address unknown." Yet even then, the Americans showed empathy, offering comfort, sometimes sharing extra paper or stamps. In moments of sorrow, humor became a lifeline. Some POW women began sketching cartoons of camp life, of horses, of guards with oversized cowboy hats. Laughter echoed through the barracks at night. In one documented case, a U.S. soldier brought an old guitar to the camp. Soon, evenings were filled with a strange blend of German folk songs and American country tunes. Guards and prisoners, once separated by war, now shared melodies. It didn't erase the pain of loss, but it reminded them that life and laughter could survive even inside a fence. For the German women, the horse became a symbol of trust, freedom, and reconciliation. When they first arrived, many feared physical punishment or forced labor. Instead, they found themselves caring for animals, riding under supervision, or helping with farm work. The horse, in Texan culture, was sacred, a companion of both work and liberty. Sharing that connection bridged cultures faster than any speech could. One POW woman, once a nurse from Hamburg, described her first ride. "At first I was afraid, but when the horse began to move, and I felt the piquet wind, something inside me broke. all the hate, all the fear. It was the first time I felt alive again. Photographs taken secretly by U.S. personnel show women smiling awkwardly on horseback, unsure whether to feel guilty or grateful. Those images became enduring symbols of compassion in captivity. Even decades later, some of those women, when interviewed, said that the memory of the horses stayed with them more vividly than the war itself. Every act of kindness, a cup of coffee, a song, a horse ride, was more powerful than any leaflet or broadcast. It dismantled years of Nazi propaganda brick by brick. Many of these women had believed the Allies to be monsters, yet the monsters brought them food, books, and moments of laughter. This psychological dissonance changed them deeply. In their post-war testimonies, several former POWs admitted that their time in Texas was the first time we saw what freedom really looked like. They began to understand democracy not as a political idea, but as a way of living, one based on respect and empathy. A former POW wrote decades later, "I left Germany proud but afraid. I left Texas humbled but free." By the time the war ended, these women were no longer the same people who had stepped off the transport trains. They had seen compassion from the unlikeliest of men, cowboys, guards, farmers, and it had changed them. For some, returning to post-war Germany was more difficult than captivity itself. The open skies of Texas had shown them a version of life they would never forget. And as ships carried them home across the Atlantic, many turned back one last time, thinking of those horses, that laughter, and the American strangers who treated them not as prisoners, but as people. Climax, Turning Point, Part 1. By the spring of 1945, the winds of war were shifting decisively. Germany was collapsing. The Allied advance was unstoppable. And yet, behind the fences of Texas, something remarkable was unfolding. A story not of conquest, but of quiet humanity. The German women POWs, once defiant and wary, now stood at an emotional crossroads. They were beginning to trust the very people they had been told were the enemy. It began with the radio broadcasts. Through guarded channels, the POW camps received news updates. Word spread that Berlin was surrounded. Then came the whispers. Hitler was dead. In Camp Hearn, silence fell over the dining hall when the American officer read the official notice aloud. Some of the women stared blankly. Others wept. A few refused to believe it. For years, Nazi propaganda had presented the Führer as infallible. Now his fall shattered the illusion of invincibility. That night, in the barracks, conversations turned from war to survival. "What happens to us now?" one woman asked. No one had an answer. Yet outside, under the vast Texan sky, the guards still treated them the same, respectfully, almost kindly. The contrast was striking. The regime that promised them glory had abandoned them, while the enemy offered them dignity. It was a moment of profound reckoning, and the beginning of emotional surrender. A week later, a group of POW women was taken to a local ranch for work duty. The fields shimmered with new wheat. Horses grazed nearby. The American supervisor, a middle-aged cowboy named Bill Haskins, noticed one of the women staring at a young colt near the fence. "You ride?" he asked. The woman, a former schoolteacher named Lotte from Dresden, shook her head nervously. "No, not since I was a child." "Then today's a good day to remember," Haskins said with a grin. The guards watched cautiously but didn't intervene. Slowly he helped her onto the saddle. The horse moved gently across the pasture, the late afternoon sun painting gold across her face. For a brief moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She was simply human again. When she returned, tears streamed down her cheeks. "You let me ride," she whispered. "We thought you would chain us." "Ma'am," Haskins replied softly, "you ain't a slave. You're just lost for a while." Word of the horse ride spread quickly among the camps. It became symbolic, a story retold again and again, proof that kindness could exist even in captivity. Soon after Germany's surrender in May 1945, the American mood shifted. Victory celebrations erupted across the country. In the camps, the guards shared their rations: Coca-Cola, donuts, cigarettes. The women hesitated at first, suspicious. Then they tasted the sugary drink, bit into the soft dough, and laughter broke out. For years they had been told that American food was childish, weak, and artificial. Now, standing under the Texas sun with donuts in hand, they realized how absurd that propaganda had been. A group of POW women even began calling themselves jokingly Die Texanerinnen, the Texas women. One American sergeant noted in his diary, "They no longer fear us. Some even ask about our families. It's strange. We were trained to guard them, but now it feels like we're protecting something fragile. Hope." By midsummer, official policies softened. POWs were allowed more freedom within the camp. Some were trusted with tools, others helped manage livestock. A sense of community began to replace captivity. The guards started bringing radios to the barracks, playing swing music. The German women learned the rhythms, tapping their boots along the floorboards. On one quiet evening, after a long day of work, a young American corporal named James offered his harmonica to one of the POWs. She smiled shyly, then began to play a familiar German tune, Lily Marlene. The sound echoed across the camp, soft and haunting. Even the guards fell silent. In that moment, the war, its politics, hatred, and blood, felt far away. All that remained was the shared ache of humanity. In late 1945, the repatriation process began. The war was over. The camps would soon be empty. When the first transport orders arrived, there were mixed emotions. Many of the German women were eager to see home, but for others, leaving Texas felt like leaving safety. They lined up by the gate in neatly pressed uniforms, holding small bundles of belongings. The same American guards who had once watched them suspiciously now stood solemnly, offering parting gifts: small handkerchiefs, chocolate bars, postcards. A few women wept openly. One hugged her guard before stepping onto the truck. "You treated us better than our own did," she whispered. The engines roared to life, the trucks rolled forward, and the fences that once defined their captivity disappeared in the distance. The moment the last transport left, a heavy silence settled over the camp. The guards stood watching the horizon long after the dust had cleared. They had not fought together, they had not shared language or belief, yet somehow they had shared something greater: respect. And in the quiet aftermath of war, that respect became the truest victory of all. Climax, Turning Point. Part 2. The story of the German women POWs in Texas reached its most emotional turning point not in the heat of conflict, but in the stillness of peace. The guns had fallen silent, but the real transformation was happening inside the human heart, on both sides of the barbed wire. As the months passed, the American officers noticed subtle changes. The German women, once guarded and uniform in demeanor, began reclaiming pieces of their former lives. Some began writing poetry again. Others painted small watercolor landscapes of the Texas horizon: wide skies, red earth, golden grass. A few even volunteered to teach English classes to fellow POWs, bridging language barriers that once defined enmity. The camp commandant, Captain William Reeves, noted in a report to Washington, "These women have adapted to camp life with remarkable discipline and grace. What began as captivity has, in many ways, become rehabilitation." Outside the camp, local Texans began to hear of the unusual harmony. Ranchers and townsfolk, initially wary of the enemy, started visiting the camp, bringing pies, fabric, and even church choir music sheets. For the first time in years, the POWs were being seen not as symbols of the Reich, but as people. One of the most extraordinary episodes came from a goodwill initiative led by the Red Cross and American Psychological Services. The idea was to help POWs record their experiences before repatriation, to document emotion, humanity, and recovery through photography. To everyone's surprise, a group of German women was given access to cameras. At first, disbelief rippled through the camp. Cameras were instruments of propaganda during the war, and now the enemy was being trusted with them. But when the first photos developed, the WWII results astonished everyone. They didn't photograph fences or guards. Instead, they captured smiles, moments of laughter over laundry, shared meals under the sun, even a young Texan girl handing apples through the fence. One particularly famous image showed a POW woman braiding another's hair while a U.S. soldier leaned against a post nearby, smiling. The caption later read, "Freedom is sometimes a feeling, not a place." The photographs were later exhibited by the Red Cross, showing Americans a side of war few had ever seen, compassion behind confinement. Perhaps the most symbolic act of trust came from the local Texan Cowboys themselves. They had worked alongside POWs for months, sharing sweat, stories, and laughter across the open plains. When the harvest ended, the ranchers organized what they called the Farewell Roundup. It was half celebration, half ceremony, a gathering of soldiers, cowboys, and POWs under the setting sun. Horses lined the pasture, saddles gleaming, the air thick with the scent of hay and dusk. The cowboys invited the German women to ride with them one last time. Many hesitated, unsure if it was proper or even allowed. But then one woman named Anna, a former nurse from Hamburg, stepped forward. She mounted the horse clumsily at first, then steadied herself. The crowd cheered softly. Soon, more followed. For the next hour, laughter echoed across the field. The sound of hooves blended with country music playing from a Jeep radio. It wasn't victory or defeat. It was liberation of the soul. When the sun dipped below the horizon, one of the cowboys removed his hat and said quietly, "Y'all ain't our prisoners anymore. You're our guests." It was an ending no one had expected from war, the enemy treated with dignity, and the captors transformed by kindness. Before repatriation began, many POWs were allowed to write final letters. They couldn't be mailed. Censorship and logistics prevented that, but they were kept as historical archives. Among those letters were confessions, apologies, and gratitude. One, written by a 27-year-old woman named Hilda, read, "When we were captured, I expected punishment. Instead, I was shown respect. In this camp, I remembered how to be human. I will never forget that the ones we were told to hate treated us as equals." Those letters became testimonies, quiet but powerful reminders that compassion could survive even the ugliest wars. When the repatriation train finally arrived, the atmosphere was a mix of relief and sorrow. The women lined up by the platform holding small suitcases, wearing U.S.-issued coats against the morning chill. The camp band played softly. Sentimental Journey. Some POWs waved from the windows. Others pressed their hands against the glass, tears running freely. On the platform, a few American guards saluted as the train began to move. One shouted, "Take care of yourselves!" Another tossed a folded handkerchief through the window, embroidered with the Texas star. As the train rolled away, the women looked back through the steam and dust, watching the faces of their guards fade into the horizon. For many, it wasn't just a farewell to captivity. It was a farewell to a chapter of their lives that redefined what it meant to be human. When the train disappeared, Camp Hearn grew silent again. Only the wind remained, sweeping through empty barracks that once echoed with laughter and foreign songs. And in that silence, the lesson of that unlikely chapter in history became clear. Even in a world torn by hate, humanity, when given a chance, always finds a way back to the surface. Aftermath. Part 1. When the war finally ended and peace treaties began reshaping Europe, The echoes of life in the Texas POW camps lingered far beyond American soil. For the German women who had lived behind those barbed wires, and for the Americans who had guarded them, the experience had left marks far deeper than any uniform could hide. In the winter of 1946, ships carrying thousands of German prisoners began sailing back across the Atlantic. Among them were hundreds of women who had lived in the Texas camps, nurses, clerks, and auxiliary service members. As their ships approached Bremen, Hamburg, and Bremerhaven, they looked out to find a homeland they could barely recognize. Cities lay in ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash and stone. Smoke still rose from collapsed factories, and once bustling ports were silent but for the creak of cranes scavenging wreckage. Many of these women had left Germany during the height of the war, when faith in victory was still strong. Now they returned to a nation stripped of its pride, its homes, and its future. One POW recalled in a post-war interview, "Texas had felt more alive than Germany. Over there I heard laughter again. Here, even the birds were gone. Their uniforms were gone too, replaced by simple civilian coats issued by the Red Cross. But inside, the memories of Texas, the warm sunlight, the kindness of cowboys, the laughter of children, glowed like distant campfires against the cold ruin of home." Reintegration was not easy. For some women, their time in American captivity made them targets of suspicion. Neighbors whispered that they had been spoiled by the enemy. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the knowledge that while they had eaten bread and fruit in Texas, their families had starved in bombed-out German cities. But many carried something powerful back with them, perspective. They had seen a different kind of enemy, not a monster, but a human being. Not propaganda's demon, but a farmhand, a teacher, a father. In quiet gatherings across post-war Germany, former POWs began speaking out against hate. Some volunteered with international relief organizations. Others helped re-establish women's groups that promoted peace, reconstruction, and literacy. A former POW named Lotte became a nurse in Munich and wrote in her memoir, "The Americans taught me that compassion is stronger than command. They defeated us in battle, but they restored our humanity in captivity." Those words echoed through post-war Germany, carried by letters, memoirs, and whispered stories shared in kitchens and courtyards. Back in Texas, Camp Hearn and similar sites across the state slowly closed down. The barbed wire was taken down, the guard towers dismantled, and the barracks sold for lumber. Yet memories refused to fade. Local families kept mementos, wooden carvings, embroidered cloths, hand-painted postcards, gifts from the POW women who had once lived among them. In some small towns, American women remembered the laughter they had shared across the fences, sometimes exchanging recipes, sometimes just trading smiles. One Texan woman, whose family owned a ranch near the camp, later said in an interview, "We thought they'd hate us forever, but they thanked us instead. It made us realize the war had taken so much from both sides, except our ability to be kind." In the 1950s, letters began to cross the ocean, handwritten messages between former German POWs and the Texans who had once watched over them. Some were simple Christmas greetings. Others carried photographs, a woman holding her newborn child, a family standing beside a rebuilt home, a Texas rancher proudly showing his new barn. One letter from a German woman named Elsa read, "When I ride my bicycle through the fields here, I remember the open land of Texas. It was the first place I breathed freely again." These connections became invisible threads of reconciliation long before formal alliances like NATO bound Germany and the U.S. together again. What began as captivity had turned into a foundation for understanding, a small human victory inside a global tragedy. The story of the German women POWs in Texas wasn't just about war or surrender. It was about what happens when humanity outlives hate, when compassion breaks through where ideology once ruled. And that quiet transformation was only the beginning. Aftermath, Part 2. By the early 1950s, much of the world had moved on from the chaos of war. Yet for the German women who had once lived as POWs in the heart of Texas, the memories remained vivid. For them, the war had ended not with gunfire, but with the unexpected kindness of their former enemies. In the years following their return, many of these women began sharing their stories, first in private diaries, and later in small-town newspapers across Germany. Their recollections often surprised their readers. They wrote not of cruelty, but of courtesy, not of punishment, but of learning, not of hatred, but of strange, improbable friendship. Elizabeth Kruger, a former communications clerk captured in 1944, described in a letter to a friend, "In Texas, I learned how freedom feels, not because I was free, but because I was treated as if I could be trusted." Stories like hers traveled quietly through post-war Europe, challenging the stereotypes both sides had built during years of propaganda. American soldiers, too, carried their own memories home. Stories of German women who helped in camp kitchens, taught English to their fellow prisoners, and once, on Christmas Eve, sang Stille Nacht softly through the fences while the guards listened in silence. That shared humanity, born in captivity, was not erased by time. By 1955, West Germany was rebuilding physically and morally. Many former POWs became part of that rebirth. Women who had been in Texas now worked as teachers, nurses, or translators in Allied sectors, using the English they had learned behind barbed wire to bridge communication gaps between Americans and Germans. Some joined new cultural exchange programs, returning briefly to the United States, this time not as prisoners, but as guests. One woman, Frieda Neumann, wrote after visiting Texas again in 1958, "When I saw the old camp, it was gone, only the wind remained. But in town, people still remembered us. They called me Fräulein Frieda and said they never forgot my singing." Moments like these captured the quiet reconciliation that politics alone could not achieve. The war had ended a decade earlier, but peace, real, human peace, was still finding its voice. Meanwhile, in Texas, a new generation was growing up hearing stories from parents and grandparents who had once lived near POW camps. For some, those camps became local legends, places where the enemy had planted gardens, built furniture, and even held concerts. For others, they were a lesson in mercy. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small museum opened on the grounds of the former Camp Hearn. Among its exhibits was a black and white photograph of German women, POWs sitting on horseback, smiling nervously as American cowboys guided the reins. The caption read, "Enemy riders, when trust was stronger than fear." Visitors often stopped to look longer at that image than any other. It captured something beyond military history, a moment of transformation, frozen in time. Decades later, descendants of both sides began to connect. Through social media, archives, and local histories, the grandchildren of Texas Guards and German POWs exchanged stories, photos, and memories. In 2017, a woman named Anneliese, the granddaughter of a former German POW nurse, visited Texas for the first time. Standing where the camp once stood, she whispered to a local historian, "My grandmother said Texas was the first place she felt like a person again." The historian simply nodded, his eyes glistening in the dry Texas sun. "Then Texas did something right," he said softly. The war had been about power, ideology, and conquest. But in those small, overlooked corners of history, the camps, the canteens, the dusty Texan fields, something greater survived. When German women POWs were treated with dignity instead of disdain, the cycle of hate began to fracture. Their memories of coffee shared with guards, of horses instead of chains, of laughter beneath the same open sky, these were not grand political gestures, but small human victories, victories that mattered. Because in the end, history is not only written in treaties or battles, it is written in how one human being treats another when the world has forgotten mercy. And on the sunlit plains of Texas, in the shadows of the war's end, mercy was quietly reborn. Reflection, closure. The story of the German women POWs in Texas is not one of defeat, it is one of rediscovery. Far from the smoke and rubble of Europe, these women found something few prisoners of war ever experienced: the dignity of being treated as human again. In a world still echoing with hatred, the American choice to show respect instead of revenge carried a quiet power. The women had expected humiliation, yet found compassion. They had been prepared for punishment, yet were given purpose. And when they were offered a simple ride on horseback, that moment became symbolic of something far greater, a journey out of bitterness and into understanding. The horses, the open fields, the endless Texas sky, all became part of a memory that transcended borders. Because sometimes humanity is not rebuilt in parliaments or peace treaties, but in the smallest acts of decency between former enemies. When the war ended, many of those women carried their Texan experiences back home. They told their children that not all Americans were cruel, that not all captors were heartless. And those stories, whispered at kitchen tables, written in fading diaries and passed quietly through generations, became their own kind of peace treaty. Today, the ruins of those camps have vanished. But if you stand in the open Texas wind, you can almost hear echoes of laughter, the rhythm of hooves, the murmur of two languages learning to coexist. It reminds us that even in times of destruction, compassion can survive, and that true victory is not measured in surrender or conquest, but in the courage to see humanity where the world has told you not to. In the end, history often remembers battles, but sometimes it's the moments of mercy that define us more, because somewhere in Texas, in a war meant to divide the world, a group of young German women once rode horses instead of wearing chains. And for a brief moment, they remembered what freedom felt like.